Hello and welcome to Gifts of the Completed Life. My name is Lynn Barger Elliott, and today we will continue the Transitions and Transformation series where we will explore what I like to call the in-between spaces. We might experience these spaces within our families, with our health, and in our relationships. In-between spaces can be disorienting and challenging, and yet there are also gifts of the completed life that can be discovered in that space between where we were, where we are, and where we are going. Future episodes in this series will reflect upon transformations when we no longer find ourselves in between, and where we can discover gifts such as drying our wings and finishing strong. Life is full of transitions, times when we find ourselves in those in-between spaces, a space between where we are and where we are going. Even as we approach death, studies show that over 80% of us will have visions and dreams of siblings, parents, and grandparents, and even pets who have died, seeming to blur the boundaries between the living and the dead. Though this liminal space, which studies show spans across religious, cultural, and ethnic groups, once considered a state of confusion or even delusion requiring medical treatment, these visions now, intriguingly, are increasingly understood to have meaning, to offer gifts for the dying, as well as the living. Today we are exploring two gifts of the completed life, which can appear in the in-between space between life and death. I distinctly remember the call I received in my senior year of high school from my father telling me that his mother, my grandmother, had died. He said he and his two brothers and two sisters were there with her in the hospital room. She knew they were all there. They were holding her hands and talking with her. But she also knew her parents, both long deceased, were standing in the corner. She explained to my father that they were waiting for her, and when she was ready, they would guide her toward what looked like a bright white tunnel, which she could see in the distance. Have you ever had an experience like that, or heard someone tell a similar story? Dr. Christopher Kerr, Chief Medical Officer at the Center for Hospice and Palliative Medicine in Buffalo, New York, has conducted several studies with patients who were dying. In 1,400 interviews with individuals who were in the last stages of their lives, his research revealed that over 80% said they had actually dreamed of or seen visions of deceased loved ones. Some even saw their pets come to them in their final days. It was as if they showed up unbeckoned to be a guide for what was ahead. That's fascinating, isn't it? I was at the Barnes Museum last week in Philadelphia. I stood in the Great Hall and watched as groups gathered and then met a guide for a tour through the halls and walls of artwork. I live in New York City and see tour buses go by with guides narrating the history and quirky details of buildings and streets in the city. I have friends who have climbed Mount Kilimanjaro and Denali. They hired guides to prepare them for the journey and other guides to accompany them on their journeys. I myself always purchase a guidebook when I travel to a new and unknown place. I want to hear the advice and recommendations of others who've been there before me. How wonderful, then, would it be to have a guide come and meet us as we transition from life to death? It's a path no living person has traveled. It's a journey for which the living, with all of our technology and advancements, have no best practices or any knowledge of it at all. And so perhaps it makes sense that our guide should be someone who has gone before us, who is familiar with the way. How fascinating it is, as Dr. Kerr's research suggests, someone who knows us, someone we can trust, might appear to prepare us to navigate the unknown, the transition, the liminal space between living and dying. Interestingly, this is not a modern phenomenon. Dr. Kerr points out that loved ones showing up to be a guide has been recorded throughout history. In ancient Egypt, the god Anubis appears and guides one to the entrance of the underworld. Artists have depicted Michael, the archangel, hovering as a guardian in waiting, ready to guide a soul to heaven. In the Christian tradition, some have seen Jesus or the Virgin Mary waiting to take them to their next home. Shakespeare writes of Hamlet's father visiting him as he is dying. Just last year in 2023, Hadley Vlahos, a hospice nurse, wrote the New York Times bestseller, The In-Between: Unforgettable Encounters During Life's Final Moments. She tells the story of 12 patients who have had dreams or visions of someone coming to them in their last days. The visitors were mostly loved ones, including children they had lost too early, parents who had gone before them, friends who showed up to offer words of encouragement. Her patients seemed to know that these visitors have arrived to help with their transition, to ease their step into the unknown. There was Glenda, for example, who, in the final weeks of her life, talked and laughed out loud with a sister, and even apologized to the hospice nurse for being too rude to not introduce the two women standing at her bedside. There was Carl, whose young daughter came and played hide and seek. For a full day, he walked around the house, looking behind curtains and opening closets, giggling as she found new places to hide. Both Dr. Kerr and Hadley Vlahos confess they are not spiritual people. Neither brought the expectation of an afterlife to their work of caring for dying patients. They are also clear that they know the difference between hallucinations and delusions and what they saw happening with their patients. As Vlahos describes, I've seen them both, and they are not the same. While hallucinations can be anything from spiders on the wall to the house morphing around you, visitations are lucid, matter of fact to the patient who's describing them. While hallucinations can incite anxiety or fear, visitations bring with them a sense of calm and peace. Knowing this, both Kerr and Vlahos learned to step back and to listen to what the patient was telling them about the visitor. What guidance was being offered? It's their belief that the presence of the visitor was a gift, not just to the dying patient, but to the living as well. And so there are two gifts of the completed life that I would like to share with you today. These gifts offer complete moments, as Aristotle phrased it, in the sense that they are full and whole in and of themselves, lacking nothing. The first gift is what we might call the scent of a mother's perfume. And by that, I mean the awareness that we are not alone, but in fact, as Dr. Kerr described it, are surrounded by a presence that is more real than real. As Kerr and Vlahos spoke to their patients about their visitors, they received vivid descriptions of white, curly hair framing a face, the unmistakable scent of a mother's perfume, the same shade of blue on a different dress worn by a wife for each of her visits, a squeeze on the arm as a line of deceased relatives walk by the bed, as if to say, "You've got this." Research tells us that as the body ages, the senses begin to fade. Hearing and touch are the last to go, and frequently outlast consciousness. And yet, paradoxically, in each of the visits described by Kerr and Vlahos, the senses of the dying patient were actually awakened, and they could recognize characteristics that convinced them beyond any doubt of the identity of the one who had arrived. Little is said in these encounters, observes Dr. Kerr, yet much was understood. They were not going to make this journey alone. Someone they knew and deeply loved had come specifically to be with them in that in-between place. The assurance of a companion to guide the process is the first gift that can provide great comfort to both the dying patient and the family that is saying goodbye. But something else is happening here in this in-between place. Senses are being restored and lives are being brought into a new state of fullness and completion. The scent of perfume can bring joy and reassurance. The second gift I would like to highlight today is what we might call the heart's desire to heal. Now, I'm not a doctor, but I've done some reading about the heart. And from what I can understand, it is made up of cells that are different from other human muscles. This is particularly significant when an injury occurs. The cells of a human muscle can heal through regeneration, meaning they can literally recreate themselves into a new and better condition. So if we are playing a sport and get hurt, or if we fall and bruise ourselves, the injured muscle, thanks to human stem cells, can divide, regenerate, and start the healing process. However, the heart does not contain those same cells, which can regenerate and create new and healthy cells. In other words, the heart cannot heal itself. Instead, it requires an external impetus or influence. Over and over again, Kerr and Vlahos would be told about visitors who would come to heal a wounded or broken heart. Often this trauma and pain was too deep for words, and even the family members knew nothing about them. And yet, as they are preparing to die, a visitor appears to help to lift the pain, remove the guilt, heal the brokenness. For example, Kerr describes an army unit of fallen soldiers that appear in Mac's dream. They greet him and help him walk to shore. They tell him what he could never tell himself throughout his life. It's all right. It wasn't your fault. You were there for us, and we will come and be there for you. A mother rocks back and forth as if she's holding a baby in her arms. Her 4 adult children stand perplexed at her bedside, wondering what is happening to their mother as she softly whispers and sings to someone named Danny. It's only after their aunt arrives the next day that they learn about a pain their mother had carried and kept to herself their entire lives. Danny was a baby their mother lost in childbirth before any of them were born. He had come in her final hours to tend to her brokenness and to remind her they would soon be reunited. In that in-between place, what Kerr and Vlahos heard in these stories was a quest to heal what is broken, to wipe away any regrets, and to lift heavy burdens and set them aside. It was as if the visitor said, "Let me take these. You won't need to carry this to the place you are going." They experienced the gift of complete, full, and restoring moments of the heart's healing. Life is full of transitions, times when we find ourselves in those in-between places, where we were and where we are going. Even as we approach death, most of us, studies say over 80%, will have visions and dreams of visits from those who have been long gone, blurring the boundaries between the living and the dead. And it is in this liminal space gifts appear, like the scent of a mother's perfume and the heart's desire to heal. Moments of fullness, moments of meaning, moments of a completed life. Thank you for joining us for Gifts of the Completed Life, Transitions and Transformations. And thank you to Zoe Wilshire, the editor of Completed Life Podcasts. We invite you to join us for our next episode as we consider the gift of fermentation. To listen to other episodes of Gifts of the Completed Life or our other podcast series, Voices of the Completed Life, you can find us on your favorite podcast platform or visit our website, completedlife.org, and go to the Programs tab and scroll down. We would love to hear from you. Please send us your reflections, comments, and ideas of gifts or your stories of the completed life by emailing us at info@completedlife.org.